Welcome to Quiet Scare, where horror doesn't scream, it whispers. Real documented experiences, selected with care, and adapted for quiet, sleep-friendly listening. Truth stays firm. The mood deepens. Please like and subscribe, and tap the bell for new episodes. No more than 3 ads in the first 15 minutes, then uninterrupted playback. Literary horror shaped from authentic accounts for sophisticated listeners. Sleep well and dream dark. I'd been driving since dusk, the kind of long stretch where the road narrows to a ribbon and the radio turns to static. The rain had started halfway through the pass, just a slow hiss across the windshield that blurred the headlights into white ribbons. My gear was packed in the back seat, tent, stove, food sealed tight. Everything for a quiet weekend at a campsite most people forgot existed. I'd driven this route before, but that night it felt different, as if the fog had erased the map itself. A shape appeared ahead, faint in the beam. Someone stood near the shoulder, soaked through, hand raised in a slow-motion wave. I pulled over out of habit more than sense. When the door opened, the smell of wet soil swept in. He looked about my age, backpack slung low, eyes tired but oddly blank. Said he'd been out hiking and lost his way before the storm rolled in. His voice carried a calm that didn't fit the situation. He climbed in, dripping water onto the mat. I told him I could take him as far as the ranger turnoff. He nodded but didn't say where he was headed. For a while, the sound of the rain filled the cab, a steady muffled drumming. Then he started talking about the woods, how trails used to run deeper, how an old service road led to a lake that didn't show up on maps anymore. The more he talked, the more I realized his details didn't fit the area at all. The lake he described was miles from here, part of another range entirely. When I asked how long he'd been out, he hesitated, then smiled without answering. I noticed his pack was almost empty. No tent, no sleeping roll, not even a flashlight. Only a thermos that rattled when he shifted it between his feet. I wanted to ask what was inside but didn't. The heater had fogged the windows, and the world outside felt sealed away. The fog thickened as we climbed. The GPS flickered between routes, then went dark. He kept glancing at the clock, tapping his fingers against his knee, as if waiting for something to happen. I started to feel a wrongness that had no name, like being watched. Though there was no one else on the road, the turnoff appeared at last, just a narrow split marked by a crooked sign. He told me to stop there. I pulled over. He thanked me in that same flat tone and stepped out. Before closing the door, he leaned in and said, almost casually, that it wasn't wise to camp near the river anymore. Said the ground was soft and things had been coming loose lately. Then he vanished into the fog, no flashlight, no visible trail. I waited, headlights aimed into nothing, then drove off. It wasn't until I reached the campsite that I noticed the smell. Damp metal, faint and sour, clinging to the seatbelt where he'd sat. The thermos noise echoed in my head. I packed my things in silence, left the car running, and turned back down the mountain before the rain could start again. Later that week, a local news report mentioned a body found near a washed-out path by the river. A hiker, they said, missing since spring. They showed a photo, different clothes, longer hair, but the same face, same eyes. The thermos turned up in the search, sealed and rusted shut. I changed the channel before they said what was inside. I don't drive that route anymore. Even on clear nights, the fog seems to find me in the mirror, following the curve of the road just out of reach. We'd been hiking for 2 days before we found the stone. The trail wasn't marked on any of our maps. It just wound off from the main ridge and dipped into a hollow where the air stayed unnaturally still. The 5 of us had planned the trip as a break from the city. Tents, a lake, and a long weekend without reception. But the weather had other plans. Gray clouds hung low from the start, and thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills like a warning that never quite arrived. The stone stood waist-high, blackened by age, its surface carved with shallow grooves. Moss covered half of it, but underneath, you could make out lines that might have been letters or symbols. One of my friends brushed it off and said it looked like a boundary marker. Another joked it was a grave. We laughed because that's what you do when you're standing in the middle of nowhere and something doesn't fit. We set up camp nearby, mostly because it was the only flat ground for miles. That night the rain started, a slow, steady fall that soaked the tarps and turned the soil to dark clay. I couldn't sleep. The wind pushed against the tent walls, and through the sound of it I thought I heard something else, a rhythm like footsteps in wet grass. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of standing at that same clearing. Only the stone was gone, and the ground beneath me pulsed like breath. By morning, 2 of the tents had collapsed in the mud. We packed to move higher, but one of the guys noticed new marks on the stone. Thin, fresh cuts across the surface, glinting pale under the gray sky. None of us said much after that. We blamed the weather, or maybe an animal, but there were no tracks around it, only the soft impression of something that had pressed outward from below. That night we stayed up by the fire, trying to shake it off. Someone told a story about a lost village swallowed by the lake decades ago. The way he said it, you'd think he'd seen it himself. I remember watching him stare into the flames, eyes unfocused, lips moving long after his voice had gone silent. When I finally looked away, the others were watching too. The fire crackled, hissed, and threw up a column of sparks that hung in the damp air longer than they should have. We left the next morning, but not together. One group went ahead, and I followed with the last of the gear. I passed the hollow again, couldn't help it, the trail curved that way, and saw that the stone was leaning now, half sunk into the soil as if being pulled down. Something about that slope felt wrong, like the ground wanted it back. That night, even safe in my apartment, the sound of rain returned. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I started dreaming again. The same clearing, same hollow, but this time the stone was upright, clean, waiting. I haven't camped since, but sometimes when thunder rolls in the distance, I catch myself smelling that same wet clay, as if the earth is reminding me we didn't bury anything that day. We only uncovered what was already awake. The call came just after midnight, when the rain had started to turn from steady to hard sheets that rattled the windows. I was on rotation for the county search team, and the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Lost hikers near the northern ridge. Last contact about 2 hours ago. It wasn't unusual. That stretch of mountains swallowed signals and scents alike once the weather turned. Still, something in her tone told me this one felt different. By the time I reached the trailhead, fog had rolled in thick enough to cut the beams from my truck's lights. The trees loomed like shadows pretending to be solid. I checked my gear radio, first aid, flare kit, and started up the path. The mud sucked at my boots. There was no wind, only the heavy silence of a storm catching its breath. About a mile in, I found their camp. The tents were still standing, though one had collapsed inward, poles bent as if from weight. Food left open, gear scattered but not looted. The fire pit was half filled with muddy water. What struck me most was the absence of prints, only a single line of impressions leading toward the creek and stopping abruptly at the edge. The water there moved slow and dark, carrying bits of ash. I tried the radio, but static answered. I climbed higher to get a signal, and that's when I noticed the smell. Wet pine mixed with something faintly metallic, like old batteries left in the rain. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, kept walking, following what looked like torn fabric snagged on branches. It led to a clearing where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. Something had dragged through the mud there, wide and uneven, like a tarp pulled by one hand. A sound broke behind me. 3 quick snaps like sticks underfoot. I turned the light, but saw only fog moving between trunks. My own voice sounded small when I called out. No answer. I moved back toward the trail, heart racing in that dull, practical way you get when fear meets training. My compass needle spun once, before settling again. Further up, I found a jacket, half buried in runoff, zipped and heavy. I almost didn't touch it. Inside the pocket was a GPS tag, with the name of one of the missing hikers. The timestamp showed movement half an hour after the distress call, well past when the battery should have died. That detail stayed with me. The rain grew colder. I turned back toward camp, marking my way with orange tape. Once I reached the tents again, the air felt heavier, like the storm had dropped all at once. The flap of the collapsed tent moved slightly, though there was no wind. I crouched and shone the light inside. Only empty sleeping bags, pressed flat as if someone had lain there moments before. No footprints leading away. When I finally regained signal on the descent, I called it in. By morning, a full team went up with dogs and sensors. They found nothing, no trace of movement, no signs of struggle, just that same camp slowly sinking into the mud. The search was closed after 2 days. Weather took them. Someone said, "Happens." I still think about that clearing, about how quiet it was. The department filed it under lost persons, but I kept the GPS tag in my desk for months before turning it in. Sometimes, when the radio hums between calls, I hear faint static that almost forms a voice, like someone still trying to check in. I tell myself it's just the interference from the ridge, but when storms come through and the fog hangs low, I turn off the radio completely and listen to the silence instead. The first night was calm enough to make me think the trip might fix things between us. We hadn't been good for months. Small arguments, silences that filled rooms. But the campsite was quiet, and the air smelled like pine instead of old conversations. I told myself that was progress. We found the spot by chance, a public campground tucked beside a lake, halfway up a mountain road. It had picnic tables, a gravel loop for cars, and just enough distance between sites to pretend we were alone. She said she loved the sound of the wind in trees. I wanted to believe her. By sunset, the tent was up, the small fire caught, and she was laughing again. I remember thinking that laughter might be the whole point of getting away to prove we still could. We ate canned chili and watched bats skim the lake surface. When we crawled into our sleeping bags, she reached for my hand like she used to. The air cooled fast. I heard owls and water lapping against rock, and for a few hours I let myself think we were safe from whatever had been pulling us apart. At dawn, a noise woke me. Not wildlife, a human sound, distant metal on metal. I unzipped the tent enough to look out. Mist clung to the car, parked 20 feet away. Nothing moved. When I stepped out, the chill bit through my shirt. The first thing I noticed was the car door. Deep scratches ran down the paint, long and uneven, like someone had dragged a key or knife along it. The side mirror was bent forward. The cooler we'd left on the picnic table was tipped over. The food scattered. Lid cracked. I called her name. She sat up inside the tent, blinking at the light. When she saw what I was staring at, she gasped. "Someone came through," she said, voice tight while we were sleeping. She said she'd heard something in the night but thought it was animals. Her hands shook as she helped me check the site. The fire pit had been stomped out. A line of dirt crossed the ground like a footprint dragged sideways. I walked the perimeter looking for tracks but found only our own. No tire marks near the road, no broken branches, nothing stolen except calm. I took pictures with my phone for the ranger, but there was no service. She wanted to pack and leave immediately. I told her we'd drive to the station after breakfast, but she couldn't sit still. She kept saying they could come back. We drove down the hill to the ranger post by mid-morning. The man there listened, then filled out a report on a yellow pad. He said they'd had no other incidents and maybe it was kids from the nearby town messing around. He looked at the marks on the car and said they didn't match any tool he recognized. He promised to drive by later, though it sounded more polite than certain. Back at camp, she was quiet. I tried to lighten the mood, offered a walk by the lake, but she said she wanted to nap. I left her with a book and circled the water alone. When I came back an hour later, the tent was zipped and the car was locked. Through the mesh, I saw her lying on her side facing the wall. That evening, she seemed better. She made a joke about campfire horror stories and said she'd feel safer if we parked the car closer to the tent. We moved it until the headlights pointed at the tree line. When we turned them off, the night folded in again. I woke around 2 in the morning to another noise, soft like fabric tearing. I sat up. She wasn't beside me. Her sleeping bag was empty. Outside, the car lights were on. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the cold air. The rear window was smeared with mud, and the back bumper had new scratches, smaller but deliberate. She stood by the trunk, barefoot, wearing her jacket over her pajamas. Her face froze when she saw me. She said she'd heard something near the road and went to check. She said she found the damage and turned on the lights to scare whoever did it. But the angle of her footprints told a different story. They led from the tent to the car and nowhere else. I didn't challenge her right away. I helped her back inside and zipped the tent. She was shaking. I asked if she was okay. She said she was just scared, that she couldn't stand the idea someone wanted to hurt us. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to her breathing even out. In the morning, the scratches looked fresh, still sharp at the edges. I traced one with my finger and found a small flake of dried mud lodged inside it, like the dirt had been on the object before it touched the car. We hadn't left the road once. We drove home early. She insisted on keeping the window cracked the whole way, said she felt trapped otherwise. When we reached the city, she didn't want to unpack. She sat on the couch staring at nothing. A few days later, I went to get the car washed. When the attendant handed me the keys back, he asked if we'd had an accident. I told him someone had vandalized it. He pointed at the scratches and said they looked like they were made with a house key, not a knife. I asked how he could tell. He said the lines were shallow and curved, not straight, like someone holding a key in their hand, he said. That night, I checked her keychain while she was showering. The edges of one key were bent and chipped. I didn't know what to do with that information. I waited until the next day. We were eating breakfast when I asked again about the night she heard noises. She froze mid-bite, then said she didn't remember exactly. When I mentioned the footprints, she stared at me for a long time before whispering, "You think I did it?" I told her I didn't want to think that, but the words were already between us. She started crying hard, sudden, messy tears. She said she'd felt me slipping away for weeks, that the trip was supposed to prove we were still us. When it didn't, she panicked. She wanted me to feel protective again, to hold her like I used to. She said she thought if we faced something scary together, we'd remember how we were. She called it stupid. I called it something else. But quietly. After that, there wasn't much to say. We stayed in the same apartment for another month, moving around each other like ghosts. One night, I came home to find her things gone. Her key on the counter. No note, just the silence of finality. I got the car repainted eventually, but every time I washed it, I saw faint shadows where the scratches had been. The paint was smooth, but memory isn't. Sometimes when I drive past campsites off the highway, I catch myself glancing at the trees for a second too long. It's not fear anymore, just the echo of it. I still camp, but never with someone who needs the wilderness to fix what broke indoors. The ranger's report is somewhere in a drawer folded between receipts. It lists the incident as vandalism by unknown individuals. I never corrected it. Maybe that's for the best. The truth would only sound strange on paper. A weekend meant for healing that turned into a quiet unraveling. A night where love tried to prove itself with damage. And a morning where both of us knew it couldn't be repaired. I keep a small notebook in my top pocket when I hike. Not for heroic thoughts, mostly for trail directions, quick sketches and reminders to drink water before a headache starts. That's the person I was when this happened, an amateur adventurer who wrote about small trips for long posts no one read except my friend group. I wanted simple stories with a clean arc. Start at the trailhead, end at the last crumb of granola. Stay between those lines, and life stays friendly. We picked a remote mountain range because it looked quiet on the map. The state website called it lightly developed. The road in was dirt for the last stretch. That was the appeal. My friend Rowan liked the idea of a clearing with a view big enough to make you feel responsible for it. Early summer, the kind of day where the air sits on your skin without deciding to be cold or warm. We left town late morning and arrived by early afternoon. The site we chose was a wide turnout above a dry creek bed, with space for one tent and a ring of stones someone else had already stacked. Pine needles, granite dust, sun through branches in long lines. It felt honest. We set up the tent, hung a food line, and did the small chores you do to make a place yours for the night. Rowan is precise with knots. I handle the stove and the map. We planned one simple loop, up a slope that traced the ridge, across an open shoulder, down a narrow drainage back toward camp. Nothing dramatic. We could see the shoulder from the site. It looked like a fold in a blanket. Before we started, I wrote camp by Dry Creek, site above bend, 2 pines with broken tops in the notebook. I like to have anchors. We took light packs for the day and left the rest in the tent. I locked the car out of habit. The sound felt too loud out there. It echoed into the trees and then got swallowed. The trail, if it had ever been one, was mostly suggestion. We picked our way up through manzanita and granite slabs, stopping every so often to check our progress against the contour lines. We didn't see anyone. No other cars had passed us coming in. That kind of quiet can be either a gift or a warning, and you don't know which until later. On the way up, we found a bend of trees where something had bedded down recently. Pine needles pressed flat. A musky smell. Rowan guessed deer. I nodded because it was the most ordinary explanation. We kept climbing. Birds held their own conversations somewhere outside the path of our breathing. The sky developed a thin haze like someone had rubbed a thumb over it. Still plenty of daylight. The cave wasn't dramatic from the outside. It was a low mouth in a band of darker rock on the north face, half hidden by brush. We noticed it because the air coming from that direction felt cooler, and because there was a faint line through the grass that wasn't animal narrow. It looked like people had gone in and out often enough to leave a habit. Rowan said we should at least look. I said we should mark our position first. I tore a page from my notebook and drew a simple map. Ridge to the left, camp down slope to the right, cave at the top of the drainage. I tucked the page under a stone in the open, so we could find it again if we did something dumb. That's the writer in me. Leave breadcrumbs for the future version who might need them. We crouched to enter. The interior was taller than the opening suggested. Our headlamps turned the first chamber into a narrow cone, then into a room that could have fit 4 people standing if they trusted each other. The air smelled like damp mineral, and something older. Bones littered the floor near the back wall. Not a pile, but not scattered enough to be natural either. I recognized a deer jaw by the teeth and a few curved ribs. There were smaller bones I didn't want to categorize. On the left side, a ledge of stone held items that didn't belong. A cracked enamel mug, 2 empty water bottles, a cheap lighter, and a roll of red spray paint tape mashed into itself. Farther back, a blackened circle on the floor showed where a small fire had been lit, so it had crept up the rock in a handprint shape. I tried to rationalize it. Hunters sometimes use caves as blinds, or stash gear. The bones could have been dragged in by animals. People leave trash everywhere. Rowan pointed at the ceiling. A line of soot up there too, like someone had burned something that smoked more than it flamed. He pressed his lips together the way he does when he's thinking, then said we'd seen enough. I agreed. I took one photo of the ledge for my notes. I wish I hadn't. It felt like I'd taken something I should have left untouched. We turned to go. Just before we reached the opening, a voice echoed from farther inside, past the reach of our light. It wasn't a shout. It was clear enough to register the words and the tone. "Wrong cave," a man said. Then, like he was correcting himself, "Wrong place to look." My scalp prickled. Rowan froze with his hand braced on the rock. We didn't say a word to each other. We eased backward and then pivoted toward the mouth. The voice didn't follow with more. No footsteps, no cough. Just the fact of it, in a space we'd assumed was empty. Outside, the light felt brighter than it should. Rowan whispered that we should move now. I nodded. We didn't run. Running invites tripping. We took the slope in calm steps, using the trunks for balance, dropping as quietly as we could without the show of trying to be quiet. My brain made an inventory. What we had on us: pocket knife, headlamp, 1 liter of water, the small notebook, what we'd left at camp, everything that makes a night comfortable, how long it would take to reach the car if we didn't cut the drainage wrong. Every time I looked back, the cave looked smaller, like a trick in reverse. Halfway down, we heard a sound to our left, higher than the cave, like someone moving through brush without care for noise. It kept pace for a while, then angled away. We didn't see anyone. I didn't want to. Rowan kept his eyes straight ahead and said, "Low, we'll pack and go." No debate. I said yes. That was our decision, and it made the descent easier. Decisions do that. We reached the dry creek bed and followed it to the bend near our camp. The car sat where we'd left it. The tent stood in the clearing. From a distance, nothing was wrong. As we came closer, we saw the color first. Red lines across the side of the tent, sprayed in wide, messy strokes. The flap was zipped shut and then painted over. On the orange ground cloth, someone had sprayed a single word across the whole rectangle: out. The paint was fresh enough to glisten against the fabric where it pooled. The can lay on its side near the fire ring, still hissing a little. No footprints I could make use of, mostly pine duff that didn't take a clean impression. Someone had been confident enough to do this without worrying we'd return mid-act. We didn't speak for a few seconds. The woods felt thinner, like distance had changed its meaning. I walked a slow circle around the tent, keeping my hands visible even though that was for me, not for whoever had done this. Our cooler sat where we'd left it, latched. The car doors were still locked. The food bag hung from the cord between 2 pines. Whoever did this had a target. Message delivered. Rowan said we should go now. I agreed, but my head counted steps I'd need to take first. The practical ones we could finish in 60 seconds. I reached for the food line and brought the bag down. Rowan gathered the stove and the pot without bothering to clean them. He just wrapped them in the bandana we use as a pot holder. I stuffed the tent into its sack with the poles still threaded. Paint smeared my knuckles. The smell burned my nose. As we worked, I kept scanning the tree line. I have this habit when I'm scared. I look for specifics to displace the shapeless fear. There was a crow on a lower branch watching us. There was a chip in the car's windshield on the passenger side I'd never noticed. There was the sound of a small engine, far off. Maybe a dirt bike, maybe a generator. It didn't come closer. We loaded the trunk and got in the car. Rowan started the engine, but didn't back up immediately. He was listening, so was I. The red word on the ground cloth felt like it was glowing, even with the door shut. I took one breath through my nose to settle my hands. "Drive," I said. He did. The road out felt longer than the road in. Every blind curve looked like it could hold a truck across it. At one point, we saw a shape in the trees to our right. 2 people? But by the time we looked again, it was only branches bending in a thermal. 5 minutes down, the dirt widened into a turnout where a blue pickup sat with the hood up. 2 men stood beside it. One wore a gray hoodie despite the heat. The other watched us with his hands in his pockets, and no trace of curiosity. Rowan and I both looked away at the same time. We didn't stop. When the dirt turned to pavement, I felt my shoulders drop and then tense again. We passed a sign for the nearest town and followed the road until we found a gas station with a small market. Rowan pulled in by instinct. We weren't low on gas. We needed a place where other people existed. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and tire cleaner. A man behind the counter was reading a local paper. He looked up, took in our faces, and then looked past me toward the parking lot. He noticed the red on the tent through the rear window. He didn't ask what happened. He said, "Y'all just come down from the ridge." Rowan nodded. The man clicked his tongue once like a stamp on a form. He stepped out from behind the counter and pointed toward a small table with a coffee urn and styrofoam cups. "Have a seat," he said. "I'm gonna pour you something, and then you're gonna listen for a minute." We sat near the door like we needed the option to leave, while still pretending we were calm. He poured coffee, added powdered creamer without asking. and set the cups in front of us. He stood with his hip against a rack of maps and spoke in a careful, plain voice. "You got near something you shouldn't," he said. "Maybe you think you found someone's hunting blind or a kid's hangout. It ain't that. Folks run things up there sometimes. Dope, stolen stuff, grows. It changes month to month. They tuck in where they reckon nobody's gonna bother them. You come close. They do what they gotta do to keep you moving." He glanced at the red paint again. "Could have been worse," he said. "They gave you a warning. It ain't personal to you. It's business to them, which makes it more dangerous, not less." He told us that a few years back, a pair of mountain bikers took a shortcut down a skid road, came out near a camp like the one we'd found, and had tires slashed for their trouble. Another time, a couple on a day hike found a trail camera pointed not at a game trail but at their car. "When the wrong folks claim a patch, they want to see who comes and goes," he said. "You understand?" We did. Rowan asked if we should call someone. The man nodded toward a bulletin board, where the sheriff's number was tacked, along with a sheet that said "Report suspicious activity" in black letters. "You can call," he said. "They'll make a note. If you got plates or faces, it helps. Without that, it's a drive-by and a shrug. I'll call it in too, but the most useful thing you can do right now is not go back today." He wasn't dramatic about it, he was simply clear. That felt steadier than a speech. I realized I'd been waiting for someone to tell me we weren't overreacting. He did without saying those words. We thanked him. He nodded like we were paying for advice with the right currency. On the way out, I paused by the rack of maps and touched the corner of the one that showed our ridge. The paper was soft from hand. We pulled around the side of the building where our car was partly in shade. I didn't want to get back on the highway yet. I pulled out the notebook and wrote, "Red paint on tent. Out on ground cloth. Cave with bones. Man's voice. Wrong place to look. Gas station man says, grows/stealing. Do not return." I drew a rectangle for the cave and a rectangle for the tent, as if the shapes could hold what happened. Then I tore the page out and placed it under the windshield visor. I wanted it near my eyes when we drove away. Rowan asked if we should cut the tent down to throw it out. The paint would never come off. I said I'd rather leave it whole for now. It felt like evidence even if no one asked for it. He nodded and closed the trunk. We drove to a bigger town where we knew there'd be a motel with a door that locks from the inside, and a lobby with a person who'll call the police if someone unwanted comes through. That night I didn't sleep much. Each time I drifted, I woke with the image of the cave ledge. The mug, the lighter, the roll of red tape arranged like someone counted on us to understand the message. Once in the dark, Rowan said, "We were stupid." I said, "We were curious." Those two things can be close enough to confuse. In the morning, we reported what we'd seen to the non-emergency number the man at the market had pointed out. The deputy on the phone asked for cross streets we didn't have, and landmarks we tried to describe. He told us a unit would swing by when they could. He didn't make us feel like we'd wasted his time. He also didn't make me feel like anyone would hike that slope today, just because we'd called. On the way home, we stopped at a self-serve car wash to hose off the paint. It didn't lift. It bled at the edges and then set harder. I bought a tarp and wrapped the tent in it, tied the bundle with cord and wrote "damaged trash" on a strip of tape, even though it felt inaccurate. Trash implies a choice. This was a decision made for us. It took a few weeks for the tightness in my chest to stop returning at odd moments. The grocery aisle, the shower. I kept replaying the steps. We saw a cave. We went in. We heard a man's voice. We left. We found the tent. It's not a complicated sequence, but the way fear works is it wraps itself around any part you leave loose. I had to keep narrating it to myself in the way I wish someone had narrated it to me before. Plainly, without hints of myth. Not we trespassed on a cursed place, just we stepped near somebody's operation. Mundane, and therefore real. Rowan and I didn't make a dramatic pact, never to camp again. We just stopped choosing remote spots. When friends asked why, we told them I left the story out of my blog. Some things you don't write for clicks. I did keep the notebook page. It sits in the drawer with spare headlamp batteries, and a compass I trust more than my phone. The red ghost of the word out lives in my head, where I can see it when I'm tempted to ignore a feeling for the sake of finishing a loop. If you want to know whether I regret going in that cave, I don't have a clean answer. Curiosity is how you find the good things too. Cold springs, petroglyphs, a view that makes you quiet for the right reasons. But there's a difference between following a question and stepping into someone else's business. The difference is often a line of soot on a ceiling, a mug on a ledge that wasn't set there by a hiker, a voice that doesn't wonder who you are because it already knows the category you fit. When you see those, you don't ask a second question. You back out, you go home, you write it down so you remember the shape of smart next time. I keep thinking about that line in the cave. Wrong place to look. The way he said it wasn't a threat. It was more like an instruction for how not to get hurt. That doesn't make it kind. It makes it businesslike, and business can be colder than malice. Rowan says maybe the voice saved us from worse. I don't carry it that friendly. I just take it as proof that sometimes when the forest grows quiet, it isn't because of wildlife or weather. It's because someone has made a decision about who belongs and who doesn't, and you've stepped on the wrong side of that line. We still hike, we still camp with friends in places where the map has names for everything, and the ranger drives by just after dinner. We still sit by a fire and listen to the wood pop and the small sounds at the edge of the light, but we stop when the world gives us certain signs. A trail that narrows into wire, a camera where no animals pass, a can of paint in the wrong place. I don't need to learn that lesson again. If you're hearing this around a campfire, I know you want a clean ending. There isn't one. We left. We didn't go back. Someone else probably used that turnout the next weekend and saw nothing but pines and sky. That's how it goes. Danger doesn't stamp the ground so everyone knows. It lifts the canvas for a night and sets it down when you leave. I wrote the word out in my notebook and closed the cover. That's the end I get. The rest is just the sound of tires on a road that turns to pavement, and a market where the coffee is too strong and exactly what you need, and a man who's seen enough to tell you plainly to keep moving. We did. We will. That's the whole story I can tell without pretending it's bigger than it was. 2 friends, a cave, a voice in the dark, red on the tent, then the road carrying us away while the pines stand there like nothing happened at all. I want to start by saying that nothing in this story is supernatural. I wish it were. Ghosts and monsters are easier to talk about, and they go back in the bag when the sun comes up. This didn't. It's just a thing that happened to me and my friends when we were younger, and it changed the way I look at people who smile like they're doing you a favor. I was 19, halfway through my sophomore year, still the kind of person who thought I could read people because I'd done a semester of general psych. Our friend group planned a long weekend camping trip before finals as a last exhale. We wanted quiet, not the kind of campground with playgrounds and RVs and a general store that sells firewood and SpongeBob tubes. My friend Danny found a forest road online that led to dispersed sites near a creek. It wasn't actually the wilderness, but it felt like we'd slipped through a crack in everyone else's plans. We had 2 small tents and 1 bigger one. There were 6 of us. Me, Danny, her boyfriend Kyle, our friend Mateo, my roommate Tiff, and her cousin Jace who'd driven in from an hour away. We were young enough to think cheap beer and foil-wrapped potatoes counted as meal planning. We parked by a marker that said 23 nailed to a tree, carried our stuff 20 yards into a stand of pines, and called it home. The first day went like you expect. We argued over how far to move the tents from the fire ring, then argued again when someone realized smoke follows beauty, and we were apparently flawless. Kyle strung a cord between 2 trees and called it a bear line. Even though every bear in the county probably had better places to be, Mateo wandered off and came back with old fishing line he found snagged on a branch, which prompted a lecture from Danny about leave no trace, which prompted a joke from Tiff about the only trace she intended to leave being a single perfect eyelash, which made Jace choke on his beer. The weather stayed polite. The sky did that thing where it blushes before giving up on the day. Around dusk, a car rolled past, slower than the others. I didn't look up because Danny was reading aloud from the dog-eared printed map, trying to prove campsite 23 wasn't cursed. The car's brakes squeaked out on the road, then the engine cut. Branches popped. Someone got out, opened a trunk, shut it. I remember not caring. It wasn't like we owned the forest. They were a couple, older. I'm bad at ages now, but back then anyone over 35 felt like a parent. The man wore a canvas jacket that said O'Connor Landscaping in small white letters above the pocket. The woman had a pink windbreaker tied around her waist, and white shoes too clean for the dust. They were the kind of people you see sharing a shopping cart, efficient, not affectionate. They carried their tent and a hard-sided cooler down to the site just beyond ours, not far at all, where another circle of stones waited like we'd been cloned and scooted down. We waved the neighbor wave. The woman waved back, bright, like she'd been waiting for permission to be friendly. The man stuck up his chin once and went to work. I watched him for a beat, then looked away because staring is rude. It took me a minute to place him. Recognition is weird. It starts like an itch somewhere you can't scratch. I kept glancing up thinking I'd seen him at a farmer's market or the bank. The way he moved felt familiar. That slow claim-staking posture some men use around tools. When the tent went up and he stood there pinching his lower lip between forefinger and thumb, the exact same tick he used when he graded essays. My stomach buckled. I knew him. Not in a we've met at a party way, in a I had to call him Professor way. His name was Mr. O'Connor. First name Tom, I think, but we'd always called him Mr. because he taught at my high school before he slid over to adjunct at the community college for a while. He handled history, the year we did Reconstruction and the World Wars in sprint mode. He'd also coached the mock trial team, which I tried for one semester before quitting because I couldn't stand how he patronized anyone who wasn't a varsity loudmouth. He wasn't the worst teacher I had, but he was quietly the most disappointing. He encouraged certain girls to hang back after class for mentoring, which everyone pretended not to notice. He never did anything you could pin to a notice board, but he was a collector of moments. 2 long glances, a hand placed too familiarly on a shoulder, a joke that put you on an island so he could ferry you back. I hadn't thought of him for at least a year, and suddenly there he was, 5 paces away, bathed in the same firelight I was. I told myself it was fine. He was with someone. People can be different out of context. People get older and soften. I didn't say anything to the others because I was embarrassed to know him, and embarrassed at my reaction. It felt self-important to assume he would remember me. I put my palms near the fire and tried to focus on Tiff's story about a coworker who kept bringing deviled eggs to potlucks. The problem was my ears wouldn't stop tuning to their sight. The woman's laugh slid between the trees like ribbon. They came over later like neighbors do. The woman brought over a bag of marshmallows and said they were too sweet for her and did we want them, and how cute young people actually camping, and can we share the fire because theirs wouldn't catch. The man followed with a little USB speaker playing old rock. He had the confident step of someone who walks into rooms assuming the rules will fit around them. He smiled and said he knew me. He said my name. I realized he'd been testing himself on it while they set up. From Westfield, right? His voice had a sweetness under it like a candy that's been in your pocket too long. I laughed and said yes, and I told the group he'd been my teacher. Small world, Danny said, which is what you say when you don't yet know whether the world is shrinking, or you're just now seeing how close everything is. The woman told us to call her Lori. She said she and Tom were on a little road trip, making up rules as they went, seeing how the map unfolded. She had that talker's energy, filling space so other people didn't have to. She asked us about our majors, what our parents did, whether we liked where we lived. She touched my knee as if we'd been in the same book club forever. When someone mentioned s'mores, she said she had something better than sugar, and tossed a small zippered pouch onto the picnic table. It made a soft clacking sound. Mr. O'Connor. Tom opened it like a magician, revealing a trick without spoiling the marvel. He held up a handful of pills I didn't recognize. We're sharing tonight, he said. Only the brave. Mateo made a sound that could be affirmation or doubt. Kyle laughed because Kyle laughs when he's not sure what else to do. Jace said he doesn't do that stuff. Thanks. I stared. They weren't labeled. Some were pressed into neat shapes. One had a cartoon face stamped into it, which felt like something from a cautionary video. Lori said she used to be a nurse's aide, and she knew what was fun and safe, and we were safe with them. And anyway, what was college for if not mistakes? I said no. I wasn't trying to be responsible. I just didn't trust the scenario. Maybe it was the teacher thing. He kept looking at me like a trick question. He shrugged and said, "Suit yourselves," and popped one himself. Chased it with a swallow from a flask. Lori took half of something and tucked the other half into my hand like she was passing a note in class. Teacher and student. The roles kept shifting. Tiff asked what it was. Lori called it mood medicine. Mr. O'Connor called it Saturday. That should have been our cue to shut it down. But people don't do things cleanly. We slid into it like uncertain swimmers who let the current decide the distance. Mateo said he'd try one. Why not? And Lori made a game of it, closing her eyes and letting him pick. Danny raised her eyebrows at me like, "Opinions?" And I made the gesture back that said, "I don't want to be everyone's mother." Within half an hour, it stopped being theoretical. Mateo went quiet, then giggly, then silent again, his face doing the thing where the muscles don't know which expression to commit to. He leaned against the trunk of a tree and let it hold him. Tiff said she felt floaty. Jay said he'd go on a short walk to get some space, and Kyle went with him. The night developed a scene. Mr. O'Connor used it. He had that opportunist timing, that sense for when a crowd begins to turn into individuals you can steer. He brought his chair so close to mine. Our knees grazed. He told stories he'd told in class, the ones that cast him as the unpredictable teacher who'd changed someone's life by making them read a book the right way. He said I'd been smart. He said I used to sit with my chin on my hand when I was thinking, and it was cute. He said I'd grown into my face very nicely. He said it as though it were feedback on a paper. Lori watched, amused, like she enjoyed how he worked a room, and didn't mind when he picked a favorite. Danny asked him what it had been like teaching high school, and he said it was rewarding except for the rules, and he wasn't big on rules. He winked. The wink had the volume of a shout. He asked me if I'd done any mock trial stuff in college, and I said no. I wasn't interested in the idea of practicing to be self-satisfied. It came out sharper than I meant. He laughed and leaned closer, hand on the back of my chair, forearm touching my shoulder. He smelled like the flask. I shifted away. He shifted with me. His hand found the edge of my sweatshirt, toyed with the string. He told me to relax, that I was tense like always, that I should let the guardian go. I felt my brain separate, one part cataloging what he was doing, the other part calmly assessing how to arrange my face so no one would think I was making a scene. That second part is why people like him get away with things. You don't want to be the one who breaks the party. Lori noticed me notice. She said lightly, "He's harmless," as if saying it made it true. She told Danny the pills were just a nudge, and that we were all here to open something. Danny said she didn't want to open anything. Thanks. She kept her eyes on Mateo, who was now trying to drink from an empty cup with the intensity of a monk. Mr. O'Connor pressed in. His hand was on my back, then at my waist. He asked if I wanted to see the stars from the ridge. A line so tired it should have retired. I told him no. He laughed in the way grown men laugh when they want you to believe your no is a joke. He said I used to be more fun in class, which I can promise you is untrue. I stood. He stood too, keeping the distance the same. My chair clattered backward. The sound made Lori flinch and made Danny look up. Tiff giggled because she was detached from cause and effect. My body committed to the plan to walk away, but he pivoted and placed himself like a door, one hand on the tree behind me, the other as if about to tuck my hair behind my ear. He said something like, "Let me teach you something for real," and I said, loudly enough for the air to hear it, "No." That's when Jace came back, and this is the part I owe him for, forever. He'd left because he knew. I didn't know this until the next day, but years earlier he'd had an experience. Different circumstances, same script. Someone older with access to things, using a party and a fog of trust to make decisions for him. He'd promised himself he'd never sit quietly and let a scene unfold again. So when the vibe at our site went from good to suspicious, he peeled off, walked the loop, and returned specifically to check on us at the half-hour mark he'd set in his head. He reappeared behind Mr. O'Connor like he'd been watching for a cue. He didn't yell, he didn't posture, he just put himself between the man and me, like that's where he'd been standing his whole life. He spoke in a low voice that everyone could hear. He told Mr. O'Connor to step back. He called him sir, the way people use formal respect when they're about to say something that's not a request. He told Lori to collect her things, because this wasn't their campsite and they weren't invited anymore. Mr. O'Connor reacted how small men react. He puffed his chest and asked Jace if he was my father. Jace smiled without humor and said, "Worse. I'm the sober friend with a good memory." He glanced at me to confirm. I nodded like I was signing a contract. Danny stood too, moving to Mateo, speaking his name like an anchor. Kyle appeared then from the road, breathless, because Jace had texted him from the bend. "Come now." Tiff laughed again, and then stopped laughing, confused by the tension. Lori muttered something about us being uptight. Mr. O'Connor said we were ruining the night, and called me a name I'd heard boys try on in middle school. It landed differently in a man's mouth. Jace didn't flinch. He stepped closer. He told the older couple they had two options: go now, or he'd call a ranger and make a report that would be annoying to explain. He didn't threaten violence. He threatened paperwork. In that moment, it was more powerful. The couple conferred in looks, the way people do who have rehearsed their roles. Lori scooped the pouch of pills off our table with practiced efficiency. Mr. O'Connor kept his eyes on me like he wanted to pin me to the moment, make me carry it for him. Then he told us to enjoy our hollow lives, which sounded like something he'd said in a staff lounge and retconned as wisdom. They went to their site. They didn't speak to each other while they broke down the tent. It was the quietest I'd seen them. 10 minutes later, their car fired up on the road and went away in small. We didn't cheer. It wasn't that kind of moment. We cleaned up the nothing that had spilled. Mateo threw up behind a log, then slept. Tiff switched from giggling to crying and back again. Danny and I sat side by side on the cooler, not touching. Kyle asked me if I was okay. I said yes, because that's the word you use until you understand what happened to you. We didn't sleep much. Jace took the first watch. We didn't use that word, but that's what it was. Someone staying awake with a headlamp around their wrist, listening. I dozed in pulses and kept waking to the feeling you get when a dream is replaying something true that your waking brain has decided to ignore. Morning made everything look like fiction. It was so bright it felt ridiculous that night had happened where we were sitting. The forest didn't hold grudges. We built a small fire for warmth and reheated the last of the coffee in a dented pot. The ritual you do when you need a script. That's when the post-mortem started, and that's how revelations do. Not in a detective's conference room, but while someone picks pine needles off their sock. We pieced the night together from angles. Danny described the way Lori had tried to normalize everything. How her patter felt like it was designed to make me distrust my instincts. Kyle admitted he'd felt uncomfortable but didn't know how to intervene with an adult who presented as an authority figure. Tiff remembered almost nothing, which frightened her, and she apologized for laughing when she did. She said that giggling is her panic response, which none of us had known. It matters to know that about your friends. Mateo woke clammy and ashamed and quiet. He said he took something because he didn't want to be the one resisting fun. He said it was stupid. We told him it was human. He asked if he did anything. We said no, not really, not more than we could handle. He didn't meet my eyes for a long time. Later that day he would, and he'd squeeze my hand and say he was sorry for not seeing what I needed when I needed it. That apology remains one of the most sincere I've ever received. And then there was me. I said his name. I told him who he'd been to me. I told him about the small things he did in class that didn't add up to a crime, but built something you had to climb over. That triggered Danny's memory of an older cousin who'd had Mr. O'Connor in high school, who had mentioned weird vibes that her mother waved away because he was a good teacher. Jace, staring into the last stripe of coffee, told us about his own history, not to make it about him, but to frame why he came back when he did. He described how the person who hurt him had relied on the politeness of the young and the exhaustion of the old. He said he wasn't going to watch that pattern replay. He said he saw the scene and recognized the choreography. While we were still sitting there, a forestry truck rolled down the road and parked by the marker. A ranger got out, a woman around 40, practical and alert, the kind of person you trust immediately with whatever needs doing. She said she was checking sites after a report about loud music near the ridge in the night. Nothing to do with us. She asked how we were, and because she asked professionally, we told her in the same tone, not everything, not the parts that felt like confessions, but enough. She didn't say you should have called. She didn't say kids. She said, do you want to make this formal? And then, seeing our eyes flick to nothing in particular, added, or I can make a note and keep an eye out for the vehicle if you can describe it. We gave her the make and color as best we remembered. I gave the name on the jacket because I wanted to say it out loud to someone who could write it down. She nodded and said that sometimes people treat dispersed sites like their private property for their worst selves. She said they've had issues before with adults bringing in substances and younger groups getting caught in the wake. She didn't use the word predators, but she didn't need to. She told us if we stayed another night, she'd swing by after dark. It wasn't a promise that would make a movie. It was the kind that actually helps. After she left, the air lightened a little. We ate granola, and the last orange cut in 6. We cleaned like we were trying to make the place deny we'd ever been scared. Packing becomes a kind of repentance after a bad night. You fold and stack and tie down, so you can tell yourself you're a person who knows where things go. On the way out, we stopped in town for gas and a bathroom that flushes. Danny ducked into the hardware store to buy paracord because she felt like we should own some. She came back with paracord and a story, because small towns gossip with the accuracy of a ledger. The clerk, who looked like she'd seen and survived many kinds of people, asked where we'd been camping. When Danny told her, the clerk nodded in a way that said she wasn't surprised. She asked if we'd run into a man in a landscaping jacket and a woman with white shoes. Danny said we had, and the clerk said carefully that there'd been talk about that man for years. Nothing that sticks in court, just a tale of girls who didn't feel okay after time alone with him. He moves around, the clerk said. He gets older, but his type stays the same age. That made my hands go cold. You think it's your private story, then you learn it has chapters in other people's lives. We drove home quieter than the road deserved. When we unloaded, the hallway felt too bright. I showered for a long time without trying to scrub anything away. It wasn't that kind of contamination. It was in the architecture, how trust is built into the way you decide who to listen to. He'd used that. He'd used being my teacher like it was still true. I told my parents that week I didn't want to, but I did, because silence is the soil those people plant in. My mom cried and apologized for not protecting me from a thing she couldn't have known about. My dad went quiet in a way that scared me more than if he'd shouted. They didn't make it worse, they just sat with me and let the story be exactly as big as it was. We made changes that look small if you don't know why they matter. We agreed as a group to have a plan for new people at campsites. Who talks, who says no, who texts a check-in when they take a walk. We talked bluntly about drugs, what we would never take from strangers, what we would never share without labels, what we would never normalize for the sake of appearing cool. We decided no would be the end of a sentence, not the beginning of a debate. A month later, I heard through a friend that Mr. O'Connor had resigned from a part-time teaching gig at a different community college after concerns were raised by students. It wasn't a headline, it was a footnote in my hometown's rumor ledger. Maybe someone else said his name out loud in the right room. Maybe the ranger saw his car again and took down the plate. Maybe the timing's just coincidence. I've learned not to wait for resolution in a neat envelope. Here's what I do know. That night taught me that violation of trust isn't a metaphor. It's a practical skill some people practice, the way other people practice an instrument. They learn the notes of friendliness, the chords of credibility, the rhythm of a gathering, and they play a song that makes you feel off balance and guilty for dancing. Sometimes all you have is another person who knows the song and walks over and turns off the speaker. I'm not telling this to frighten you out of going into the woods. The woods weren't the problem. I still go camping. I still sit by fires with friends, but I don't confuse warmth with safety. I don't assume shared air means shared ethics. And when an older man smiles like he's here to teach me something I didn't ask to learn, I do not worry about being rude. If you're imagining it as a movie, don't. Movies resolve into credits and a song. Real life just moves into whatever you do next. Laundry, lunch, a call from your aunt, another exam. On the nights I can tell this straight through without my voice tightening, I think about Jace standing there and making a choice that wasn't dramatic, just firm. He didn't rescue me from the woods. He rescued me from a story someone else was trying to write in my name. That's the whole of it. A campsite with a number. A man with a memory he shouldn't have kept. A woman with a smile like a distraction. A few pills that got their way. And friends who did not let politeness be the last word. We packed our trash, we left no trace, but I can still point to the tree where my chair fell. If I went back, I bet the bark would look the same. It's not the place that holds it for me. It's the lesson. And if you're young and think you owe anyone access because they say your name like they bought it, here's your permission slip. You owe no one your trust but the people who earn it. And sometimes protecting yourself looks like making someone else uncomfortable. We survived. We learned. We told it out loud. That's as neat as this kind of thing gets. We used to call it Camp Hollow Ridge, though the faded sign just said Ridge Camp in peeling red letters. I'd spent 3 summers there as a camper, and now at 17 I was back as a junior counselor. It felt like cheating time, walking the trails I once stumbled over as a 10-year-old. Now in sneakers I bought with my own paycheck. The cabin still smelled like mildewed wood and mosquito spray, and the lake still caught the last light in a way that made you stop walking mid-sentence. The senior counselors liked to break curfew. Nothing crazy, some beers, a Bluetooth speaker, whispers and laughter rising like steam under the pines. We hiked past the firebreak trail that first night, just beyond earshot of the cabins. I remember watching the smoke from our campfire vanish into the black canopy. Somebody passed me a drink. Somewhere an owl called once, then went silent. It started small. That same night, a motion light near the rec hall flicked on twice when nobody was nearby. One of the other counselors, Ben, figured it was a raccoon or a deer. But when we went to check, we found the screen door hanging off its frame. Inside, the chairs had been overturned, and a trail of mud led in, then out, as if someone walked in barefoot. We didn't wake the kids. Instead, we reset everything, told ourselves maybe it was the wind. But wind doesn't leave bare footprints. Over the next few days, things kept slipping sideways. Flashlights went missing. One of the kayaks turned up drifting on the lake, half full of water. Every night, at least one counselor swore they heard twigs snapping behind their cabin, or caught a glimpse of movement in the woods. We started walking in pairs, then groups. At night, I found myself listening for things I couldn't name. Pauses between tree frogs, the cut of silence after a cricket stops mid-chirp. What stayed with me most was what we found behind the arts and crafts shed. It was Meg who spotted it, just after breakfast when the sun was still low enough to cast long shadows. She'd gone back to grab her sunglasses and came running back, pale as the paper plates we were using for pancakes. We followed her. Behind the shed, something had arranged 3 long sticks into a symbol, 2 crossed, 1 jammed through the center vertically. Tied around the top were loops of thorny vine, still green, still bleeding sap. The thorns had been bent into a rough spiral, and tucked in the center was a strip of red cloth. Ben said it was a prank. I didn't say anything, but I knew none of us had worn red. And the thorns, I'd cut my hand just brushing against one on a trail cleanup last summer. Whoever made this, they'd handled them like thread and needle. We took the kids canoeing that afternoon, but I couldn't relax. Even their laughter felt like it was echoing off something heavy, something watching. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning I stepped outside. The night was thick and still. Even the cicadas had gone quiet. The forest edge near the flagpole seemed darker than usual. I squinted. That's when I saw it. A figure, too tall, not moving, wrapped in something that hung stiffly from its limbs. I thought at first it was wearing a ghillie suit or maybe a blanket, but then it shifted only slightly, and I saw how the branches around it seemed to draw in closer as if pulled toward it. Something hung from its shoulders, a long strand of thorny vine that dragged along the ground. The moonlight caught small, sharp points glinting along it. I backed away, slow. My hand found the cabin wall behind me. When I blinked, it was gone. The next day, 2 of the girls said someone had knocked on their cabin window in the night. 3 soft taps. When they looked, no one was there. We didn't tell the kids anything. We told ourselves it was an animal, or maybe some local messing around. But we started locking the cabins, even though the doors barely held their hinges. The last night, the wind changed. A storm was coming. You could smell it, metallic and charged. Most of the counselors had turned in early. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that symbol, those thorns. I needed to know if it was still there. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The woods were dead quiet. No frogs, no rustling, just the low creak of trees shifting under invisible pressure. I found the path by memory. When I got near the shed, I turned off the light. Didn't want to draw attention. The symbol was gone, but something else was there. A figure crouched beside the shed. Its back was to me. The air felt wrong, like the seconds were stretching. I took one step and it turned. Slowly, its face was hidden. Wrapped maybe, or smeared in dark paint or mud. Hard to tell. But its shoulders and chest were draped in thorny vines. Some fresh, some brown and cracking. One hung from its arm like a sleeve. Another coiled around its neck. The smell hit me earthy, sour, something like copper. It didn't move. I turned and ran. No shame in it. I sprinted blind through the brush, branches slapping my arms, roots trying to grab my feet. When I reached the main path, I looked back. Nothing followed. Nothing I could see. That morning, we called the ranger. He did a sweep. Found nothing but the trampled grass near the shed. Said it was probably a bear. That week, they cut the session short and sent everyone home a day early. I didn't go back the next summer. Sometimes I still wake up thinking I hear 3 soft taps on my window. Just 3. No more. I don't check anymore. I've learned not to. When I came back home that summer, the air smelled like cut hay and wet stone. My village sat between 2 low hills in eastern France, the kind of place that barely shows up on maps. My parents' house looked smaller than I remembered, like time had drawn it inward. After a year in Lyon, I thought I'd feel restless here. Instead, everything felt too still. The first few days I unpacked, slept late, walked the road that led past the vineyards. One morning I decided to hike to the reservoir, the man-made lake where my friends and I used to swim before the lifeguards banned it. It wasn't far, maybe an hour through pine and chestnut. I hadn't been there since I was 14. The path was just as narrow, just as overgrown. The sound of insects built and faded like breathing. When I reached the ridge above the lake, I stopped. The water had dropped since I last saw it. The far shore was bare clay, cracked and pale, and then I heard it. Faint, metallic, a single bell ringing somewhere in the trees. At first I thought it was a goat bell, maybe from a herd up the hill, but it came again closer this time, short and uneven, like something being moved by hand. I turned in a circle, listening. That's when I saw it. Down near the shoreline, something white against the mud. I climbed down and realized it was a small animal, maybe a rabbit or cat. Its body twisted unnaturally. I didn't go closer. The bell had stopped. The wind moved through the trees once. Then the forest went completely silent. I walked back to the village without looking behind me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a fox. Maybe local kids being cruel. but that sound stayed in my head. It wasn't the distant, steady clinking of livestock. It was deliberate, slow. 3 days later, with the sky threatening rain, I went back. I told myself I just wanted to prove it was gone. The air felt thick, heavy with humidity. By the time I reached the halfway point, the light was already dimming. The trees on either side leaned inward, dripping from a short shower. When I reached the lake, I saw the animal again. But it wasn't lying in the mud anymore. It had been hung from a low branch by something like fishing line, its limbs arranged, its head missing still. I froze. The wind moved it slightly, and the bell rang again. Not from the branch, from deeper in the woods. It was close this time. The sound came in bursts. Ring, pause, ring. I couldn't see anything moving, but I could feel that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled. I turned to go, and that's when I saw the figure between the trees. Tall, motionless. Something metallic hung around its neck, swaying. The bell. For a moment, we just stood there. Then it tilted its head slightly, and the bell swung once, ringing loud enough to echo off the water. I ran. The path was half mud, half roots. I slipped, got back up, kept going. Branches snapped behind me, too heavy for wind. I didn't look. My phone was in my pocket, but my hands were shaking too hard to use it until I reached the first clearing. When I finally managed to call my parents, all I could say was my name and lake. They found me on the road 10 minutes later, soaked and crying. The police searched the next morning. They found tracks, barefoot, human, but washed out by rain. Near the tree line, they found something else, a folded shirt, mine, the one I'd worn on my first hike, the one I hadn't realized was missing. They told me it was probably a prank. My parents said maybe someone from town had followed me. I didn't argue, but sometimes late at night I hear that bell again. Not in the distance, but faintly, from somewhere too close to be outside. I tell myself it's just a sound memory, something my mind keeps replaying. Still, I keep the window closed, even in summer. It was supposed to be a casual night out, just a group of us from town camping by the quarry. Someone brought a speaker, someone else a few beers, and by dusk the whole ridge was glowing orange from the fire. I'd come mostly because of Leia. She was new to our circle, quiet but funny, the kind of person who made everyone else listen when she finally spoke. I wanted to make her laugh, that was all. As the evening went on, I could feel the tension in me, some mix of nerves and wanting to look brave. The quarry wall rose behind us, maybe 20 feet high, sloped just enough that the older kids used to climb it for a dare. I remembered them bragging about jumping from the top into the lake before it was fenced off. It looked smaller now, but in the dark everything feels possible. Bet no one here's ever gone up there, I said louder than I meant to. A few people looked up. Leia did too, her face caught in the firelight. Someone laughed. That was enough. I started up the slope, gripping dry weeds and loose rock. Halfway up, the earth shifted under my foot. The sound of small stones sliding away was louder than the music. Someone shouted for me to stop, but I kept going. I told myself I couldn't back down now. By the time I reached the top, my palms were scraped raw. The air was still. I could see the whole group below, their faces tilted up toward me like I was performing. The fire looked smaller from up there. I spread my arms and yelled something stupid, maybe see, or told you, and in that instant I felt like I'd won something. Then the ground gave out. It wasn't a full collapse, just a corner of the ledge crumbling beneath my left boot. My body twisted, and for 1 second I was weightless. My hand caught a jagged root. The rest of me swung out over open air. I heard gasps, someone screaming my name, the distant clatter of rocks hitting water. I didn't fall far, maybe a few feet before slamming into the side. Pain shot through my arm. Dirt filled my mouth. Somehow, I managed to hold on until 2 of the guys climbed up and pulled me back. When I finally reached the bottom, Leia was there, eyes wide, silent. My arm wasn't broken, just bruised and cut, but I couldn't look anyone in the eye. Nobody laughed. The fire felt colder after that. Later, when the others slept, I sat by the dying embers listening to insects and my own heartbeat. I realized it wasn't bravery that made me climb. It was fear. Fear of being ordinary, of not being seen. The next morning, I hiked back alone to look at the wall in daylight. The path I'd taken was steeper than I remembered. The ledge was thinner. I kicked one loose stone and watched it tumble all the way down. It landed with a dull thud instead of a splash. The lake had dried halfway since last summer. I still go camping sometimes, but I don't climb anymore. When I see someone else about to do something stupid to prove themselves, I look away, not because I don't care, because I understand exactly what's in their head. The silence that follows when everyone stops laughing is louder than any applause. I was working seasonal maintenance along the D35 patching fences, clearing brush where the forest met the farmland. It wasn't much pay, but it kept me moving. That week, I stayed in a rented room above a closed cafe in a small village near the hills. By evening, the place emptied out so completely that even the church bells sounded lonely. One afternoon, I met a man on the trail. He wore a dark cap, carried a sack over one shoulder, and said he was trapping animals for study. Foxes, mostly. He spoke slowly with a strange accent, not quite local. We chatted a few minutes about weather and roads. He asked if I worked alone. I said yes, though something in his eyes made me wish I hadn't. The next day, I found one of my markers moved. A metal stake bent sideways, the flag missing. Nearby, the grass had been flattened as if someone stood watching the trail for a long time. That evening, when I locked up my truck, I noticed muddy footprints by the rear wheel. The third night, I went to the small diner at the edge of the village. The owner, an older woman, asked where I was staying. When I told her, she frowned and asked if anyone else had keys. I said no. She lowered her voice, said travelers sometimes had things go missing there. Then she mentioned a man who used to trap animals in the same woods. Someone who'd vanished years ago. His cabin had burned down, but locals still found wire snares and bones around the area after rain. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of a bell or maybe metal tapping came from outside, rhythmic but uneven. I told myself it was just tools shifting in my truck bed. Around midnight, I looked through the window. The road was empty, but the grass near the ditch moved, as if someone had just stepped away. I left before dawn, drove north until the forest gave way to open fields. When I stopped for gas an hour later, I checked the back of the truck and found a scrap of cloth wedged between the tailgate and bumper, dark green, frayed, smelling faintly of smoke. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the police. They wanted to confirm if I'd worked near St. Laurent that week. A hiker had found traps there, fresh ones, still baited. I asked if they caught anyone. The officer said no, but they'd found signs of a small camp. Ashes, wire, and a notebook too damaged to read. I told myself it couldn't be the same man. Still, sometimes when I pass through that region for work, I see the hills the same way I saw them that night. Quiet, unbroken, as if nothing human had ever moved through them. But when the wind shifts, I swear I can smell the faint tang of metal and smoke again. We left the highway just before dusk, a silver line of cars swallowed by the pines. I'd met Ben and Carla a few months earlier on a hiking forum, and they'd invited me to tag along for a long weekend. Just a few of us, a borrowed camper and the open road. I'd done this kind of thing before, traveling light, trusting new faces for a few days of quiet. They seemed normal enough, kind in that easy road trip way. By the time we reached the clearing, the sky had folded into a deep gray, the air heavy with the smell of rain and wood smoke from someone else's fire, somewhere down the valley. We set up near the tray line, the last patch of flat ground before the slope fell toward the river. Around 9, a pickup rolled in. 2 men climbed out, middle-aged, smiling too wide. They waved, said they were heading farther up, but saw our lights, and figured they'd share a drink first, then welcomed them instantly. I remember thinking how easily he let strangers in, how the warmth of his voice almost embarrassed me. The men brought out a cooler and started talking about how they'd grown up hunting out here, how there were old cabins nobody used anymore. They said we should come up in the morning, see the view. One of them kept glancing at our camper door between stories. The rain started slow, just a whisper through the leaves, then turned steady. We all crowded under the awning, trading names and jokes. I kept noticing little things. The way one man's boots were spotless despite the mud, how the other asked twice how long we'd been there. Carla offered them coffee, but they said they'd brought their own and opened bottles from the cooler. A sour metallic smell drifted out. Something about it set my stomach off. I caught Ben's eye and murmured that maybe we should pack it in. He shrugged, smiling, but his expression didn't reach his eyes. When the lightning flashed, I saw the men's truck was gone from the slope where they'd parked. I thought maybe I was mistaken, that the light played tricks. But when one of them offered to grab something from the truck, he turned toward the woods instead of the road. The sound of branches snapping came after. Carla laughed nervously, asked if it was a bear. No one answered. Then came a low voice from the dark, someone calling my name. Just once, quiet and certain. My throat tightened. I looked at Ben, but he was frozen, hand still on his mug. I moved first, saying something about checking the gear in the camper. Carla followed. Inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. We waited. Footsteps scraped outside, slow, deliberate, then silence. After a long time, the rain eased and the wind shifted. I peeked out through the curtain's edge. The campfire was gone, only wet embers steaming in the dark. No sign of the men or their truck. I shook Ben awake before dawn. None of us spoke much as we packed up, just the hiss of wet gravel under the tires as we left that place. Later, when I told this story around another fire, someone pointed out what I'd missed: the clean boots, the way they'd never actually shown us a vehicle, the voice that knew my name. I tried to laugh it off, but I still hear that tone sometimes when the rain starts to fall in the trees, soft and close, as if someone's standing just beyond the light waiting for me to turn my head. It started with the wind changing. We'd been hiking all afternoon, the four of us, and by nightfall the sky had that bruised purplish look that comes before a storm. We found a flat spot near the ridge and set up camp, the last light dying behind the mountains. I remember thinking how still it felt once the tent flap stopped moving. No birds, no bugs, just the hush before the weather turned. I've always been the practical one, the kind who checks maps twice and keeps dry matches in a sealed bag, but even I felt something off about that silence. After dinner, the air seemed to thicken. Every sound carried too far. The crack of a branch, the flap of the tarp, our own breathing. Then the noises started, short, sharp taps like pebbles hitting the tent wall. I told the others it was branches breaking in the wind. Carla didn't buy it. She said it was too even, too deliberate. Ben laughed and said maybe it was the ghost stories from the old ranger station getting to us. But when he unzipped the tent to look, nothing moved out there, not even the trees, just mist curling low along the ground like smoke. By midnight, we were all awake. The taps had turned into scraping sounds like someone dragging a stick just beyond the light of the fire. I checked the perimeter twice with my flashlight. Found nothing. No prints, no animals. The mist had thickened into something almost solid, swallowing the beam after a few feet. Carla whispered that she saw a figure in it, tall and thin. Ben told her to stop imagining things. I wanted to agree with him, but the hairs on my arms stood straight up. We decided to douse the fire and stay quiet until morning. Around 3, the storm hit. Rain hammered the tents, thunder rolling in slow waves across the ridge. Between the cracks of sound there was something else, low, rhythmic, like breathing right outside the fabric. I counted the seconds between lightning flashes, trying to time it, but the next flash showed nothing. Just rain and fog. Still, the breathing didn't stop. When Carla finally screamed, I thought she'd seen something, but she only pointed toward the corner of the tent where the fabric bulged inward, as if a hand pressed gently against it from the outside. I tore open the flap and swung my light across the clearing. Nothing. No tracks. No movement. The fog was breaking apart under the rain, revealing slick leaves and wet stones. The pressure on the tent vanished. By dawn, the air was clear again. We packed without speaking. Ben joked weakly that it was probably the wind funneling through the ridge, but his hands shook as he rolled the tarp. Carla refused to look back as we left. I tried to tell myself it was all explainable, that fear just plays tricks when the senses overload. But later, when I checked my phone photos, the last one I'd taken, just before the storm, showed a faint shape behind us in the mist. Too tall for any of us, standing perfectly still. I've looked at that photo dozens of times. The shape doesn't move, doesn't change. Maybe it's a trick of the light, or maybe it's something I'm not supposed to explain. Every time the weather shifts and the wind falls silent before a storm, I think of that ridge and how close the air felt, as if something unseen was breathing right beside us, waiting for us to listen again. We were supposed to be on the scenic route, that's what Leah called it, laughing behind the wheel of her dad's old van, while the rest of us passed snacks around and argued about playlists. A storm had pushed through the night before, knocking out GPS signal and soaking most of the mountain roads, so we decided to stop somewhere to wait it out. That's how we ended up in Dryfield, just a speck of farmland, 2 gas pumps and a diner with one porch light that flickered like it hadn't been changed in years. A man in coveralls waved us down as we slowed near the diner. He looked to be in his 60s, wiry but solid, like someone who worked with his hands. Said his name was Gerald and that the inn was full from weather-stranded folks, but we could crash in his guest house just up the lane. He even offered stew and dry blankets. Seemed too good to be true. But Leah shot me a look like, what choice do we have? The house sat on a slight hill, backed by rows of skeletal trees. The siding was weathered, paint flaked in long curls, but the inside was clean and warm. Gerald lit a fire and brought out mugs of cider. We thanked him and settled in, rain beginning again in sheets. At first it was fine, cozy even. He told us where to find the bathroom, the emergency flashlights, the extra quilts in the trunk at the foot of the bed, but he kept standing in the doorway long after we'd said goodnight, watching, almost smiling like he was waiting for something to happen. After he left, the wind howled louder than it had any right to. I chalked it up to the house's shape or the storm rattling the eaves. But sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of humming, low, tuneless. It moved past the windows. Then I heard the back door latch click. Leah whispered my name. She'd heard it too.
We sat frozen in our sleeping bags while the humming moved through the house into the kitchen, then closer. Slow, steady footfalls, then nothing.
We didn't sleep much. At first light, we packed fast. That's when we found the van wouldn't start. Battery dead, despite having no issues the night before. Gerald appeared, cheerful as ever, already holding jumper cables like he'd been waiting for us to try. "You folks leave already?" he asked, grinning just a little too wide. Leah thanked him, but her voice was stiff. He hooked up the cables, but the van still wouldn't turn over. Said it must be something deeper. He could take a look in his shed. Might take a few hours. I lied and said we had family nearby coming to get us. Said we just needed to wait by the road. His smile faltered for half a second before he said, "Suit yourselves." We walked 3 miles before finding a gas station with a working phone. A local tow driver said Dryfield had no inn, just the diner and a few homes. Nobody named Gerald lived there. In fact, that hilltop house had burned down over a decade ago in a lightning storm. No one rebuilt it. But I remember the smell of that cider, the grain of the wooden floor, the sound of that latch clicking shut behind us. I had set out from the trailhead just before dusk. My plan was simple. one night alone in the national forest, record some audio for a project on natural soundscapes, then head back before the weekend crowds. I'd done this kind of thing before. Solo hikes were my version of clearing out the static, but this time felt different before I even made camp. About 3 miles in, just as the last light drained from the sky, I started hearing a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't animal, too rhythmic. 4 short bursts like air pushed through a reed. I paused my steps to listen, but it stopped when I did. Figured it was echo or my pack creaking. Kept going. I set up camp near a mossy ridge, just off the main trail. Hung my food, pitched the tent, started recording. I sat with my back to a tree and let the mic run while I took notes. The air had that damp metallic tang you get before a storm, but the sky stayed clear. Around midnight, the pattern changed. I woke up to a soft series of knocks. Not on wood, more like thumps on the ground. Steady and measured. Not close, but not far either. I held my breath and checked my watch. Just past 12:30, I stepped out of the tent with the recorder still running. The forest was silent. No wind, no insects. Just that pressure in the air, like everything was holding still. Then a dry clicking sound broke the silence. Sharp and deliberate, almost like tongue clacks. It came from the trees directly east of my camp. I tried my phone, but of course no signal. I left a waypoint beacon on my GPS and pulled the mic back inside with me. I didn't sleep. At first light, I found prints near the edge of camp. Not boot prints. They were long, narrow impressions with a deep gouge at the heel, almost like something had been dragging a hooked toe. They led downslope, then vanished in the underbrush. I packed up and headed out, but the trail felt longer than I remembered. The landscape had shifted subtly, boulders on the wrong side of the path, a bent tree I didn't recall passing. Then I found the hat, my hat, the one I'd worn yesterday morning and thought I'd lost during the hike-in. It was perched neatly on a stump beside the trail, dry and clean. When I finally reached the ranger station, I handed over the audio and asked if there had been any reports of strange activity. The ranger looked tired, maybe used to weird questions, and told me sometimes people hear echoes from the old mining shafts under the ridge. Sometimes the forest just plays tricks on you. Later, I played back the recording. Most of it was ordinary. Wind, rustling leaves, a few distant owl calls, but around the 1 hour mark, the mic caught something else. 4 rhythmic bursts, then a pause, then a soft voice, low and breathy right next to the mic. Still here. We used to come out to Rockvale Lake every summer. Just a handful of cabins tucked around a bend, private and cheap, with a dock that groaned under bare feet and a boathouse full of spiders. For a bunch of suburban kids, it felt like real wilderness. We fished. We lied to each other about who saw what in the woods. We made up stories about the family that used to own all the cabins before they were sold off. Then we grew up, stopped coming, didn't talk much, until this year, when Caleb messaged out of nowhere and said he was going back. He'd found the old place listed under a different name. Dirt cheap to rent. Said we should do one more weekend like we used to. Reminisce. Unwind. There were 4 of us. Me, Caleb, Sam, and Jen. We arrived late afternoon, a gold haze drifting through the trees. The lake looked the same, but the shoreline was more overgrown. Weeds sprouted between the dock planks. A new fence had gone up where the trail used to be. The cabin leaned slightly like it had been trying to fall for years but hadn't quite committed. Inside, the air was stale. Mice had chewed the couch cushions. The upstairs window was cracked, but the layout hadn't changed. And something about that familiarity made us laugh too loud, drink too much too fast. That first night, we talked about stupid things we'd done here. The fake seance, the time we dared Caleb to sleep on the dock. We kept skirting around the big one, the thing that happened that last summer, the real reason we never came back. I think we all expected someone else to bring it up first. On the second day, I went walking by myself, trying to find the old trail that led to the fire pit clearing. It was overgrown, but the path was still there if you knew where to look. I found it. The rocks were still ringed in a perfect circle. Charred black wood still lay in the center, as if no one had ever bothered to clean it up. There was something new, though. A rope nailed between two trees, with faded Polaroids clipped to it, faces half bleached by sun and time. Most were unrecognizable, but one had a date scrawled in marker, August 2008, our last year. I took a picture and showed the others. Jen got quiet. Sam left the room. Caleb just stared at the wall like it was telling him something. That night, none of us slept. Something knocked once, hard against the side of the cabin just before dawn. No wind, no animals, just one deliberate strike. We didn't speak about it over breakfast. Jen left early, said she had a migraine. When we finally packed up, Caleb stayed behind, said he needed one more walk down to the dock. I offered to wait. He said no. 2 days later, I got a text from Sam. "You hear from Caleb?" I hadn't. They found his car still parked by the ranger gate, cabin key on the dash, his phone on the dock, face down. The last photo in his camera roll was one of the fire pit clearing, hanging on the rope a new Polaroid. Still fresh, just him standing in the frame staring at the lens. In the quiet town of Ashford, Maine, locals prided themselves on their sense of community. The kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and everyone knew everyone. At least that's how it used to be. When Sarah Dempsey, a volunteer search and rescue member, began noticing that more hikers were going missing along Hollow Trail, she thought it was coincidence at first. The woods there were dense, the terrain unpredictable. But then came the noises. On stormy nights, from her small home on the town's edge, Sarah could hear something moving in the trees, slow, deliberate. Sometimes, lights flickered deep between the trunks, like lanterns swaying where no path existed. She brought her concerns to the sheriff's office, but they brushed her off. "People get lost out there all the time," they said. "Stop chasing stories." But Sarah wasn't chasing stories, she was finding them. Armed with her search gear and a stubborn sense of duty, she followed the noises one evening when thunder began to roll over the valley. What she found beneath a thicket of overgrowth made her stomach drop. A circle of stones carefully arranged, coated with wax residue and what looked like charred offerings. Nearby, half buried in the mud, were personal effects. A shoe, a watch, a hiker's torn map. That's when she heard it again. A low rhythmic sound. Chanting? Or maybe just the wind pushing through the trees. She never had time to decide. A flashlight beam swept across the clearing, not hers, and she ran. She made it home soaked, shaking, and breathless. When she returned the next day with deputies, the clearing was gone, the stones disturbed, the soil freshly turned. The sheriff wrote it off as erosion. The files on missing persons quietly disappeared from the town office within a week. Months later, Sarah moved away, but she still kept that mud-stained watch in a drawer. Sometimes she checks online forums, looking for others who remember the missing. But when people ask about Hollow Trail now, the locals just smile politely and say, "There's no such place around here." A group of college friends from Portland, Maya, Jason, and Luis planned a weekend camping trip in the Cascade foothills, chasing views and peace from city noise. At the general store in the nearest town, the old cashier gave them a warning with their firewood. "Stay clear of Echo Ridge after dark." It remembers what people forget. They laughed it off, assuming it was small-town superstition. Their campsite overlooked a dry ravine. As the sun dropped behind the peaks, strange symbols carved into nearby trees caught their attention. Spirals intersected with claw-like marks. Luis joked it was just teenagers or hunters marking territory. But later that night, the laughter died. From the ridge below came a sound like a voice calling their names. First distant, then closer. repeating them in tones that didn't sound quite human. Maya turned on her flashlight, and the beam caught something pale darting between the trees. They left their tents behind when they heard a snap heavy footsteps, deliberate circling. Jason grabbed the car keys, but the trail back had changed. The trees seemed rearranged, as though the forest itself had shifted. When they finally reached the road at dawn, out of breath and scraped from branches, none of them spoke about what they saw behind them. The figure watching from the tree line, motionless, head tilted. Weeks later, they found a short article online. 2 hikers had gone missing near Echo Ridge. The search teams reported finding fresh carvings matching Maya's initials on a tree far from where they camped. They don't go camping anymore, and sometimes when they hear their names whispered in the wind, they remember the warning. Some places echo for a reason. It was nearly dark when Evan Turner's car broke down on a rural stretch of highway near Mill Creek, Idaho. No cell service, just endless farmland and the promise of rain. When an old pickup slowed beside him, Evan felt relief more than hesitation. The driver, a wiry man in his 60s with a baseball cap pulled low, introduced himself as Ray, said he ran a small repair shop down the road and could give Evan a lift. The truck smelled faintly of gasoline and something metallic. At first, Ray was polite, asking standard questions, where Evan was headed, if anyone knew he was traveling. But when Evan mentioned calling his family, once he got signal, Ray's grip on the steering wheel seemed to tighten. They passed the supposed repair shop without slowing down. Evan's pulse quickened. Small details began to stand out. Scratches on the passenger door, a missing interior handle, a photo taped to the dashboard showing Ray beside someone who looked uneasy. Evan realized that he might not be getting dropped off anywhere safe. As the truck slowed for a turn onto a dirt road, Evan spotted a reflective road sign ahead, a steep incline marked Bridge Out. He made a choice. Pretending to adjust his seatbelt, he grabbed the door's manual latch hidden beneath a panel and jumped while the truck was still rolling. He hit the gravel hard, cutting his palms, and crawled into the roadside brush. The pickup stopped briefly, headlights sweeping the darkness, then drove off. Evan reached a diner hours later, shaken and bleeding. The waitress called the sheriff, but by the time a patrol went looking, there was no sign of the truck. A week later, a local paper ran a small piece about an unidentified vehicle found submerged in Mill Creek, a pickup matching Ray's description. The body inside had been there for years. Evan never found out who or what had been behind the wheel that night, but he hasn't hitchhiked since.